Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Imagine scratching off a ticket at your kitchen table after one of those rotten days where the office felt like a pressure cooker and the drive home blurred into endless traffic jams, your hands trembling slightly as the numbers align in a way that defies all odds, transforming you into an overnight multimillionaire with a jackpot that could erase every financial worry from leaky roofs to mounting medical bills. Yet instead of reaching for the phone to share the news with family or friends who might suddenly appear like long-lost relatives at a reunion, you decide to seal your lips tighter than a miser's wallet because deep down in the quiet recesses of your mind you wonder who among your so-called inner circle would truly stick around if the money evaporated like morning mist. And that's exactly where I found myself as Sarah Jenkins, a 48-year-old divorced accountant scraping by in a modest suburb of Dayton, Ohio, staring at a windfall of $250 million. That promised to rewrite my entire life, but also tempted me to play a dangerous game of testing loyalties without ever letting the cat out of the bag. The whole thing started on that unremarkable Tuesday evening when I pulled into the corner gas station after a 12-hour shift crunching numbers for clients who treated me like an extension of their calculators. My ex-husband Tom's shadow, still lingering from the divorce 2 years earlier that had left me with a creaky two-bedroom house echoing with emptiness and a checking account that barely covered the basics. So I bought the lottery ticket on pure impulse with $5 I really should have saved for gas, fantasizing briefly about settling Mom's nursing home fees without the constant guilt of scraping together payments each month, and when the scanner at the counter beeped affirmatively revealing the full jackpot amount, I felt a rush like electricity surging through my veins, nearly causing me to spill the styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee clutched in my other hand, while the tattooed clerk behind the counter merely raised a pierced eyebrow and grumbled something about how lucky breaks always come to the unlikeliest folks. But I kept my poker face intact, folding the winning slip carefully into my wallet, as if it were just another receipt from the daily grind rather than the key to a completely different existence. That night, back in my dimly lit living room with the television murmuring infomercials about kitchen gadgets that promised to revolutionize meal prep for busy singles like me, I sat there for what felt like hours, weighing the pros and cons of announcing such a life-altering event, picturing Tom's smug face as he slithered back into my life with insincere apologies and tales of how he'd always known I had potential, or my sister Lisa's envious gleam as she calculated how much she could borrow under the guise of family support, or even my high school best friend Karen, who had drifted into sporadic texts and forgotten birthdays, but might suddenly resurface with open arms. And in that moment of clarity amid the flickering screen light, I resolved to keep the entire secret locked away, testing the waters of true friendship and kinship by fabricating small crises to see who would extend a genuine hand without any knowledge of the fortune waiting in the wings, a decision that struck me as both clever and a touch reckless, like betting your last dollar on a hunch at the track, but one that felt necessary after years of giving without reciprocity in a world where money seemed to expose people's true colors faster than a litmus test. Claiming the prize turned out to be a surprisingly straightforward affair handled through a discreet trust with lawyers who specialized in shielding winners from the vultures circling just beyond the headlines, allowing me to maintain my routine of packing lunches and commuting in my aging Honda while the funds quietly transferred into low-profile accounts that wouldn't raise eyebrows at the bank, though the isolation began to creep in almost immediately as I navigated interactions with a heightened awareness of every word and gesture. Starting with the first test directed at Tom, who had moved on to a flashy life with his younger girlfriend and a leased SUV that screamed overcompensation. So I crafted a simple text message the very next morning, keeping it light and vulnerable as I typed out a request for help with a supposed car breakdown needing just $50 for a tow, attaching a photo of the Honda's actual sputtering engine to lend authenticity, since it truly was on its last legs after all those years of reliable service. And his response came swiftly, laced with feigned concern as he inquired about the vehicle's details, as if he hadn't driven it himself during our marriage. But as the hours ticked by without any actual transfer or follow-up call, I felt the familiar sting of disappointment building until evening when I nudged him again, only to receive a message claiming times were tight with his new living arrangements. A lame excuse from a man who flaunted tropical getaways on social media just weeks prior, leaving me to stew in resentment that bubbled over into a calculated bit of payback where I edited a bank statement to show an overdraft and forwarded it his way, prompting an immediate call filled with syrupy sympathy and an offer to send the money plus a little extra as interest, at which point I thanked him profusely without accepting a dime, and instead anonymously alerted his employer to discrepancies in old expense reports from our shared past. Nothing criminal, but enough to invite an internal review that would have him glancing over his shoulder for weeks on end. A revenge that carried the sweet tang of justice laced with a wry humor in imagining his panic during board meetings, yet it also left an undercurrent of emptiness as I questioned whether stooping to his level diminished the high ground I'd claimed in the divorce. Emboldened yet unsettled, I turned my attention to Lisa, my older sister, ensconced in her picture-perfect life down in Cincinnati, complete with a stable husband, 2 college-bound kids, and a minivan that embodied suburban success. Dialing her during my lunch break with a voice engineered to quiver just enough as I described a catastrophic hot water heater failure flooding the basement, with a plumber's quote hovering around $2,000 that I couldn't possibly cover after recent dental expenses. And her response unfolded in that telltale pause, pregnant with unspoken calculations, before she exhaled a sigh and offered perhaps a couple $100 since Dave and she were stretched thin with tuition payments, a paltry sum considering the times I'd quietly bailed her out of similar scrapes without fanfare over the years, prompting me to mask my irritation with gratitude and end the call swiftly before the bitterness could spill over, only to channel it later at our monthly book club gathering, which devolved more into neighborhood gossip than literary discussion, where I casually mentioned a vague generous uncle stepping in with conditions that lit a spark in her eyes as she probed for specifics, her entrepreneurial mind already spinning ways to leverage the information, leading me to orchestrate a small act of retribution by substituting her contributed bottle of wine with a bargain bin alternative and presenting it as her choice, allowing the group to rib her good-naturedly about tightening belts, while I suppressed a smirk at the poetic irony of her facing the very thrift she preached, though that satisfaction proved fleeting as it underscored the pettiness of my approach, making me wonder if direct honesty might have fostered real connection rather than this cycle of veiled tests and tit-for-tats. Karen presented the most unpredictable challenge, having been my confidant through the awkward phases of adolescence, with shared secrets over greasy diner fries and late-night drives, but life had eroded our bond as her sales career ascended, leaving less time for the casual check-ins that once defined our friendship. So I messaged her via Facebook, claiming a sudden job loss, with bills mounting, and seeking either leads or a temporary loan to weather the storm, building on the truthful undercurrent of downsizing rumors at the firm, and her initial like on the post followed by 2 days of silence before a heart emoji and a generic link to job boards without any personal outreach or financial gesture, cut deeper than expected, like an overlooked invitation to what was supposed to be a milestone event, stirring a slow simmering retaliation where I updated my status with a nebulous hint at hardships and tagged her in a fabricated online charity drive for single mothers, an ironic nod to our shared history that drew modest donations primarily from her network, while she engaged publicly with supportive comments and shares, but privately maintained distance, culminating in my signing her up for an onslaught of those intrusive junk mail subscriptions, peddling get-rich-quick schemes that would inundate her mailbox, much like her indifference had cluttered my expectations. And when she eventually texted about the deluge with laughter, labeling it karma, I couldn't help but ponder if she would find the humor when the layers of my own deception began to peel back, exposing the fortune that could have bridged the gap without all this maneuvering. By the weeks close, the burden of secrecy pressed down heavier than the reinforced safe holding the original ticket, as I lay awake in the quiet house listening to the distant hum of neighborhood life, feeling the fog of paranoia roll in from the nearby river valley, and altering even mundane routines like smiling through strained conversations at work where every glance seemed loaded with potential insight, particularly during that coffee break when my coworker Mike, the unassuming accountant with his perpetual nod of acknowledgement, overheard a snippet of my bank call discussing the influx into conservative investments to evade detection, and remarked casually that it sounded like good news for a change, causing my pulse to quicken as I Dissected his tone for hidden meanings, wondering if he'd glimpsed the truth or if it was merely polite small talk, and as the uncertainty settled over me like a heavy blanket, my phone vibrated unexpectedly with a message from an unknown number stating simply that they'd heard I was in a bind and needed to talk, leaving me frozen in the dim light of my bedside lamp, staring at the screen as possibilities swirled through my mind like leaves in an autumn gust. That mysterious text from the unknown number lingered in my thoughts like an unwelcome guest refusing to leave the party as I maneuvered through the morning rush hour traffic toward the office, my mind replaying the words over and over while trying to convince myself it was probably just some automated scam preying on folks in supposed financial straits, but deep down a sliver of doubt wormed its way in, making me glance at my rearview mirror as if expecting to spot a shadowy figure tailing my Honda through the familiar streets of Dayton, where every corner held a memory of simpler times before the divorce and the endless cycle of bills that had prompted this whole ill-advised lottery secrecy experiment, which now felt less like a clever test of loyalty and more like a self-inflicted trap tightening around my daily routine. I ended up deleting the message without responding, figuring it was better to err on the side of caution, especially since the weight of the $250 million hidden away in those anonymous trusts already had me jumping at shadows and second-guessing every interaction, from the barista at the drive-thru who handed over my usual black coffee with a knowing smile to the coworkers milling about the break room, exchanging gossip about the latest layoffs that seemed to inch closer with each passing week. Yet, despite the growing paranoia, I pressed forward with the next phase of my personal loyalty audit, turning my focus toward the family ties that had always formed the backbone of my life, even if they were frayed around the edges after years of one-sided support and unappreciated sacrifices, starting with my brother Rick, the perpetual underachiever who had carved out an existence in rural Indiana, running a handyman business that barely kept the lights on in his cluttered workshop, surrounded by rusted tools and half-completed projects that mirrored his own stalled ambitions. We had never shared the easy closeness that siblings in those feel-good family movies seemed to possess, with him embodying the wild card of the Jenkins clan, the one who ditched college for ink-covered arms and monster truck rallies, while I played the role of the responsible accountant, keeping the family's financial secrets buried deeper than Dad's old war stories. So when I dialed his number during a slow afternoon at work, catching him between what he described as back-to-back gigs, I infused my voice with just the right amount of desperation as I outlined a fabricated crisis involving the roof caving in after a recent windstorm, complete with an estimate of $5,000 for proper repairs and insurance company foot dragging that left me high and dry, wondering if he could swing by to handle it on the cheap, leveraging his supposed expertise in such matters. And his response came wrapped in that signature gravelly chuckle, promising to pencil me in as soon as his schedule allowed, which sounded hopeful at first until 2 full days elapsed without a single follow-up call or text, turning my optimism into simmering frustration, especially when I considered how he'd leaned on me during his own rough patches, like the time I'd wired him emergency funds for a truck repair without a second thought about repayment. Eventually, a message pinged through claiming he was swamped with a lucrative contract, but offering to talk me through the fixes if I covered the materials cost up front, a suggestion that struck me as particularly tone-deaf coming from the brother who had once totaled my borrowed car on a joyride and returned it with apologies as flimsy as wet cardboard, prompting me to withhold the wire transfer and instead hatch a plan that would teach him a lesson in reliability without tipping my hand. So I drove out to his place unannounced, armed with a 6-pack of his preferred brew as a disarming gesture, finding his garage a chaotic testament to unfulfilled potential with engine parts scattered like forgotten dreams. But as we cracked open the cans and shot the breeze about old times, I steered the conversation back to the roof issue, watching his eyes flicker toward the modest gold watch I'd treated myself to post-win, a subtle upgrade that didn't scream wealth but apparently caught his opportunistic radar as he commented offhand that things must be looking up for me these days. That probing remark fueled the fire of my resolve, leading me to proceed with the fake hire by sending a deposit through the app for supposed parts and then canceling it at the 11th hour, citing a technical glitch that I reported promptly, ensuring his account took a hit from processing fees while he scrambled to cover unexpected shortfalls. And when he called in a rage accusing me of stringing him along, I maintained wide-eyed innocence, suggesting he verify his own transaction history in case Of user error, a reversal that delivered a satisfying jolt of witty retribution reminiscent of turning the tables in a poker game he'd lose every time. Yet as the dust settled from that exchange, a wave of regret washed over me, making me question why I hadn't simply extended real help to bolster his struggling business, instead of engaging in this petty sabotage that only widened the chasm between us, and likely left viewers of my unfolding tale shaking their heads at my refusal to break the cycle of resentment with an act of genuine generosity, especially since the lottery fortune set idle gathering interest that could have changed his trajectory without all this cloak and dagger nonsense. Shifting gears to the more delicate territory of my relationship with Mom proved even more challenging as I planned a weekend visit to her assisted living facility, where the air always carried that sterile mix of polished floors and overcooked meals mingled with a faint scent of floral air freshener meant to mask the realities of aging, a place that had become her reluctant home after Dad passed and her arthritis turned everyday chores into Herculean efforts, leaving me as the sole pillar holding up what remained of our family structure. So I arrived with a bouquet of her favorite lilies in hand, her frail form lighting up from the armchair where she spent afternoons flipping through magazines with faded covers depicting a world she no longer fully inhabited. And as we settled into the rhythm of catching up, with her sharp eyes noting my fatigue, I wove in the narrative of the furnace breaking down, rendering the house uncomfortably cold, with repair costs totaling $1,000 that strained my already thin budget, prompting me to ask if we might draw from her modest savings to tide things over until payday. And her reaction unfolded not in outright refusal, but in a crumple of features etched with a profound regret that seemed to reach back decades, as she squeezed my hand and wished she could help more, explaining that after Dad's prolonged illness the nest egg had dwindled to cover only her basic needs here, suggesting I consult Rick for his handyman skills, a deflection that carried an undercurrent of resignation rather than active indifference. And as our conversation meandered through reminiscences of happier times, she let slip an unusual comment about how Dad had always warned that chasing lottery dreams would bring a curse upon the family, a phrase I had no recollection of from his lifetime, stirring a subtle unease in me, as if she were guarding some long-buried family lore connected to money and misfortune. Her gaze drifting away from mine in a manner that hinted at layers unspoken, making me wonder if my fabricated plea had accidentally unearthed echoes of genuine past hardships. The visit concluded with the usual embraces and assurances of future check-ins, but her subdued response lingered like a half-remembered dream, fueling a brand of revenge that skewed toward benevolence twisted with irony, as I anonymously funneled a substantial donation to the facility's resident fund, earmarking it for enhancements to meals and medications that directly benefited her without revealing the source. So when she called a few days later, bubbling with excitement over the sudden upgrades and thanking the mystery donor for easing her days, I absorbed the joy secondhand. Through the phone line, feeling a mix of vindication for her earlier sidestep and a pang of sorrow at the deception that kept me from claiming the credit outright, a choice that undoubtedly would strike the audience as unnecessarily convoluted, when a straightforward revelation could have brought tears of relief rather than this shadowy intervention amplifying the isolation I had courted through secrecy. With the family tests wrapping up on that note of ambiguous closure, I found myself reflecting during a mandatory family Zoom call orchestrated by Lisa under the banner of Staying Connected, where Rick casually inquired about the roof saga, fishing for updates while Mom dispensed vague homilies on perseverance, and Lisa dominated the screen time, lamenting her own budgetary woes without once circling back to my supposed predicaments, a collective oversight that underscored the one-way street of our bonds, leaving me to sign off with a forced smile and retreat into the solitude of my living room, where the anonymous text from earlier resurfaced in my deleted folder. But before I could dwell on it, my phone illuminated once more with the same unknown sender declaring that it was about the win and we absolutely needed to meet. Because trust me, the clock was ticking faster than I realized. The insistent buzz of that second message from the unknown sender echoed through the quiet of my living room long after the family Zoom had dissolved into awkward goodbyes, leaving me to stare at the screen where the words about the win and the urgent need to meet pulsed like a warning beacon in the dim glow of my laptop, forcing me to confront the fragility of the secrecy I'd so meticulously constructed around the $250 million jackpot that now seemed less like a hidden treasure, and more like a ticking bomb buried in the foundations of my everyday existence in Dayton, where the hum of distant traffic served as a constant reminder of how interconnected yet isolated lives could become, especially when financial desperation or windfalls altered the invisible threads tying people together. So I hovered my thumb over the reply option for what felt like an eternity, my pulse quickening with a cocktail of fear and curiosity before ultimately blocking the number once more. And tossing the phone onto the couch as if distancing myself from the device could ward off the encroaching reality that my tests of loyalty were stirring ripples far beyond the family circle, potentially drawing in strangers who might unravel everything before I could extract the truths I sought from those closest to me, a realization that injected a fresh layer of uncertainty into my already precarious game, compelling me to accelerate the next round by venturing into the professional realm where trust wasn't just personal, but tied to paychecks and promotions, amid the relentless grind of the accounting firm that had become my reluctant anchor since the divorce. Mike, my coworker, the quintessential office drone in his mid-40s with a divorce under his belt and a desk perpetually cluttered with stained mugs and overflowing inboxes, represented the safest starting point for this expansion of probes, having shared enough water-cooler banter about mutual gripes over micromanaging bosses and the soul-crushing monotony of tax season to foster a veneer of camaraderie. So during our next team lunch at the Greasy Spoon Diner down the block, where the air thickened with the sizzle of burgers and the chatter of locals nursing hangovers, I seized the moment over slices of key lime pie to drop the vulnerability bomb, confessing in hushed tones about how the paycheck was stretching thinner than ever with rent hikes and the shadow of downsizing looming like a storm cloud over the firm, prompting him to nod along with sympathetic grunts, recounting his own battles with alimony that devoured his disposable income, but ultimately capping his response with a generic pat on the shoulder and an encouragement to hang in there, because good things come to those who wait. A platitude that rang hollow coming from the man I'd covered for on more than one occasion when his reports ran late, turning what could have been a reciprocal act of support into just another tally in the ledger of one-sided favors. That left me fuming internally, with a dark humor bubbling up as I pictured him waiting for his own ship to come in while mine had already docked laden with riches he couldn't fathom. That afternoon back at the office, the sting of his indifference festered into a blueprint for revenge as I meticulously forwarded an archived email chain to the boss, one that highlighted a minor but embarrassing discrepancy in Mike's past figures, nothing that would cost him his job, but sufficient to flag him for a thorough performance evaluation during the upcoming review cycle. And when he confronted me later in the copy room, his face flushed with confusion over the apparent mix-up, I feigned wide-eyed surprise, advising him to comb through his own sent folder for any overlooked attachments, a clever deflection that twisted the knife with satisfying precision, while underscoring the irony of his earlier advice about patience. Yet, as the whispers began circulating through the break room about Sarah's sharpened edges and Mike's sudden wariness, I couldn't shake the undercurrent of regret, wondering why I hadn't chosen to mentor him through his troubles or share a legitimate tip on budgeting instead of this underhanded jab that only fortified the walls of isolation around my workstation, making the audience likely to view my retaliatory streak as short-sighted and self-sabotaging, when a gesture of real solidarity could have cultivated an ally in the cutthroat corporate landscape. Expanding the test to more distant relations, I reached out to my cousin Mark on the paternal side, a figure who'd faded into the periphery after Auntie's funeral a decade ago, but resurfaced sporadically on social media, flaunting his real estate ventures with glossy photos of lakefront properties and motivational seminars that epitomized the rugged individualism so prized in American hustles. So I crafted a LinkedIn message lamenting a potential eviction spurred by job instability and inquiring about any insider advice or a short-term loan to stabilize things until the dust settled, his reply arriving with polished efficiency as he proposed a coffee meetup at a bustling chain cafe in Columbus, where over steaming lattes he dispensed networking nuggets and steered the conversation toward enrolling in his foreclosure flipping workshop without once extending a tangible offer of aid, just a sympathetic nod and a business card that screamed opportunism, leaving me to stifle a chuckle at the absurdity of him pitching Investments to someone he believed was on the brink of homelessness, a scenario ripe for ironic payback that I executed by subscribing his email to a torrent of low-quality real estate spam from dubious sources, flooding his inbox with alerts on phantom deals and outdated leads that would sap hours from his precious hustling time, and when he messaged days later bewildered by the deluge, I responded with feigned empathy, quipping about how the market's chaos had a way of mirroring life's curveballs. A witty riposte that delivered a modicum of satisfaction, but rang increasingly empty as I reflected on how his detached helpfulness might have stemmed from genuine constraints rather than malice, prompting viewers to question my escalating pettiness for scorning a bridge that could have linked to untapped family resources without the need for deception. The workplace fractures deepened dramatically when the layoffs axe finally fell, claiming 3 positions, including a fresh-faced intern whose wide-eyed optimism had always lightened the office mood, allowing me to skate through unscathed thanks to my impeccable track record. Bolstered by the mental clarity afforded by financial security, yet during the tense all-hands meeting where the boss extolled the virtues of team players with a pointed glance in my direction, Mike averted his gaze entirely. While Karen, my erstwhile best friend, fired off an email with a lead for an entry-level gig that felt like a downgrade from my current role, underscoring her continued pattern of minimal effort, and in that charged atmosphere, I overlooked a direct plea from a junior colleague named Tina, who approached me hesitantly asking for resume polishing tips amid her own fears of the chopping block, too absorbed in my web of tests to extend the hand she so clearly needed. A dilemma that twisted in my gut like a bad decision at the casino, making me complicit in the very indifference I'd been decrying and likely drawing audience ire for prioritizing my secretive vendettas over basic human decency in a time of shared vulnerability. Just as the day's exhaustion peaked during the impromptu holiday potluck setup, early though tradition demanded it, I collided quite literally with Elena, the soft-spoken HR administrator in her early 50s, whose warm demeanor and tales of grandkid antics had always provided a quiet counterpoint to the firm's sharper edges, and when the small talk veered toward collective money woes as folks passed deviled eggs and watery punch, I vented obliquely about the bills stacking higher than the paperwork on my desk, prompting her to draw me aside in a corner away from prying ears and press a handwritten note bearing her personal number into my palm, whispering that if I ever needed to talk or more, she was available without strings attached, a gesture so unadorned and timely that it caught me off guard amid the forced cheer, leaving me to pocket it with a nod of thanks while my mind raced to place her in my mental map as little more than a passing acquaintance. Yet in that instant, she stood out as the solitary beacon in a sea of opportunists, and as the gathering wound down, my phone chimed with a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize at first, but upon playback, Elena's voice filled the line, stating she'd caught wind of the swirling rumors, and we should meet soon before the situation spiraled beyond control. Elena's voicemail replayed in my mind like a looped recording during the drive home that rainy evening, the wipers rhythmically swiping away the downpour that mirrored the storm brewing inside me as I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, pondering how she had unearthed my old number and what exactly those rumors entailed, whether they stemmed from my inadvertent slips at the office or the subtle shifts in my demeanor that even I had noticed in the mirror each morning, like the faint relaxation around my eyes, now free from the perpetual squint of financial worry, yet burdened by the secrecy of the $250 million windfall that had turned my life into this precarious balancing act between testing loyalties and evading the fallout from those very probes. So I pulled over at a deserted strip mall lot, letting the engine idle while I debated calling her back, the uncertainty twisting like a knife in my chest, because on one hand her offer felt like the genuine article amid a parade of conditional gestures, but on the other it carried the risk of exposure that could shatter the fragile control I'd maintained over this lottery-fueled experiment, compelling me to pocket the note for now and redirect my focus toward the escalating family confrontations, particularly with Lisa and Rick, whose half measures in response to my fabricated crises had festered into full-blown resentments demanding resolution before the whole web unraveled, pulling everyone down in a tangle of accusations and half-truths that would leave me more isolated than ever in this Midwestern suburb, where neighbors waved from porches, but rarely crossed thresholds without invitation. I decided to tackle Lisa first, embarking on the drive to Cincinnati the following weekend under the guise of a much-needed sisterly catch-up session. Her home, presenting its usual facade of manicured perfection with the driveway lined by kids' bicycles and a lawn that begged for envy. Yet, as we settled into her immaculate kitchen over mugs of steaming coffee that carried hints of vanilla from her latest subscription box, I dove straight into the heart of the matter, amplifying the earlier hot water heater tale into a full-blown basement flood scenario complete with visions of black mold creeping up walls and an eviction notice looming if I couldn't scrape together $3,000 by the end of the month. Watching her features cycle through surprise calculation and a feigned empathy that didn't quite reach her eyes as she set down her cup and enveloped me in a hug, promising to explore options like pawning some jewelry since Dave's latest bonus remained tied up in corporate red tape, a vow that struck me as comically inadequate from the sibling who'd once jetted off to Florida on my emergency loan without a repayment plan in sight. And as I extricated myself from the embrace, intending to head out, I lingered just long enough in the hallway to overhear her on the phone with Rick, dissecting my desperation and speculating wildly about possible inheritances or windfalls that might be lurking unspoken in the Jenkins family tree, a betrayal that cut deeper than any previous indifference, confirming the opportunistic underbelly I'd long suspected beneath her polished surface and igniting a revenge plot laced with that wry humor that kept me from boiling over entirely as I envisioned her hawking those heirloom pearls for pennies only to discover the market had tanked overnight. The execution unfolded smoothly en route back to Dayton as I contacted an old acquaintance from the firm, a jeweler with a dry wit who owed me a favor for past referrals, and arranged for him to field any appraisal inquiries from Lisa with tales of depressed values and saturated inventories, ensuring her noble sacrifice yielded zilch in return. And when she messaged me days later, her tone laced with defeat over the underwhelming offers, I responded with supportive emojis and words of encouragement, inwardly chuckling at the poetic justice of her thriftiness boomeranging back, while acknowledging that this witty sting isolated me further by burning potential bridges to the one blood relative who might have stepped up with real effort had I not layered on the deceptions, making the audience no doubt view my retaliatory games as a self-fulfilling prophecy of loneliness, when vulnerability could have invited true reconciliation instead of this escalating cycle of mistrust. Rick's confrontation loomed larger midweek when his call pierced through my workday haze, his voice roughened by frustration as he referenced Lisa's updates on my deepening troubles and floated the idea of advancing $1,000 in exchange for signing over the deed to my house as collateral, a proposition that reeked of predation from the brother who'd always prioritized his own fixes over family solidarity. And as we agreed to meet at his garage, amid the clang of tools and the scent of motor oil, I couldn't help but probe casually about his gleaming new truck parked ostentatiously in the drive, inquiring if business had finally turned the corner, to which he deflected with mutterings about side hustles, his gaze evasive in a way that echoed Mom's earlier slip about Dad's lottery curse, hinting at some inherited caution or hidden history around sudden money that I filed away as another subtle thread in the unraveling tapestry of our bonds. Sensing the deal's predatory tilt, I proceeded with a Dr. Deed document emailed in blurry scans that swapped addresses just enough to confuse any verification process, then anonymously flagged his bank for potential fraudulent activity, triggering a temporary freeze on his accounts that sent him into a frenzy of voicemails demanding explanations, to which I replied with innocent queries about his documentation practices, suggesting he might have forged something in haste, a clever turnaround that left him flailing like a fish on dry land, delivering that satisfying hit of retribution, yet amplifying my regrets as I considered how the lottery's abundance could have legitimately jump-started his ventures without this underhanded drama, prompting viewers to disagree vehemently with my choice to sabotage rather than support, especially when his greed masked deeper struggles that mirrored my own pre-win hardships. The mounting pressures converged when I finally mustered the nerve to dial Elena, arranging a discreet meeting on a park bench where fallen leaves crunched underfoot like whispered secrets, and there, under the overcast sky, she cut through the pretense with her no-nonsense candor, revealing that she'd overheard Mike's office chatter about my apparent sudden luck, including bank calls and wardrobe tweaks that didn't align with the struggling accountant's budget, and if it involved the lottery as rumors Suggested she offered congratulations laced with caution, advising on reinforced trusts and public detachment to fend off the inevitable scavengers of partial revelation that stunned me since the win's details had remained airtight through legal channels, yet her insights stemmed from keen observation rather than malice, extending her hand once more with a folder of vetted financial advisor contacts and no hint of personal gain, making her the unlikely anchor in this sea of self-interest. But as we wrapped up the exchange, my phone erupted with Lisa's incoming call, her voice frantic over Rick's banking nightmare and Mom's sudden illness from a minor fall, questioning pointedly what I had done to set this domino chain in motion, leaving me to stare at the device as the impending family showdown barreled toward me like an unstoppable freight train. Lisa's hysterical call yanked me from the park bench conversation with Elena, the words tumbling out in a rush about Rick's inexplicable bank freeze and Mom's alarming fall that had landed her in the emergency room with a possible fracture, nothing life-threatening, but enough to shatter the fragile equilibrium I'd clung to throughout this lottery secrecy saga, making me grip the phone so tightly that my knuckles whitened as I promised to drop everything and head straight to Cincinnati. The interstate unfolding before me in a monotonous stretch of rain-slicked asphalt that matched the turmoil churning in my gut, because in that moment the full weight of my vengeful machinations crashed down like a poorly constructed house of cards, revealing how the $250 million hidden in those impenetrable trusts had fueled not just tests of loyalty, but a cascade of unintended consequences that rippled through family ties already strained by years of unspoken resentments and one-sided generosities, leaving me to question whether the game had been worth the escalating isolation or if it had simply amplified the very betrayals I'd set out to expose in this quintessentially American pursuit of self-reliance turned inward. I arrived at the hospital amid the sterile bustle of fluorescent lights and hurried footsteps, finding Mom in a curtained bay looking smaller than ever with a cast on her wrist and a morphine haze softening her features, while Lisa paced the linoleum floor, her eyes red-rimmed from worry, and Rick slouched in a vinyl chair scrolling furiously through his phone as if the device held the key to unlocking his frozen assets, a sight that stirred a complex brew of guilt and vindication since his predicament stemmed directly from my anonymous tip to the bank, yet seeing the toll it took on the family unit made me pause, wondering why I hadn't chosen transparency over these shadowy reprisals, especially when the fortune could have preempted the crisis altogether, prompting any audience to my tale to side against my stubborn choices that prolonged suffering under the guise of justice rather than extending the olive branch of outright aid in a world where money's true test lay not in hoarding it, but in how it mended fractured bonds. As I approached the group, Lisa enveloped me in a desperate hug, murmuring thanks for showing up and attributing Mom's slip to the stress of my ongoing troubles that had weighed on everyone's minds during recent calls, a narrative that carried an undercurrent of accusation, as if my fabricated woes were the root cause, while Rick shot me a sidelong glare heavy with suspicion before cornering me in the hallway outside the room, his voice low and edged with frustration as he demanded to know if I had anything to do with the account lockdown, waving his phone screen showing denial notifications that mirrored the very financial desperation I'd simulated in my tests, leading me to deny involvement with feigned shock and counter by suggesting he review his own shady side deals, perhaps the ones funding that flashy truck, which deflected the heat momentarily, but unearthed Mom's earlier cryptic remark about Dad's lottery curse, as Rick muttered something about family money always coming with strings attached, a subtle clue that hinted at deeper generational secrets possibly tied to Dad's unexplained gambling losses or hidden debts that had shaped our upbringing in ways I was only now piecing together amid the beeping monitors and antiseptic air. Back in the room as Mom stirred awake and squeezed my hand with surprising strength, urging us all to stick together through thick and thin, a sentiment that clashed painfully with the opportunism bubbling to the surface. Lisa confessed over lukewarm vending machine coffee that the siblings had been whispering behind my back, speculating about hidden assets or an impending inheritance that might explain my vague updates, and if it involved something as monumental as a lottery win. As office rumors had trickled down through Karen's connections, then perhaps it was time to come clean and pool resources for Mom's care, a partial revelation that stunned me since the wind's veil had held firm through legal fortifications, yet their probing questions about the Scale of my windfall and immediate pleas for help with Rick's truck payments and Lisa's tuition shortfalls laid bare the greed I'd anticipated, turning what could have been a moment of unity into a negotiation table where hands extended not in solidarity, but an expectation, making me choose between full disclosure and a measured admission of financial shifts without specifics, offering to cover Mom's bills anonymously through the facility, which elicited grateful tears from her but calculating nods from the others that fueled one final surge of revenge as I stepped out to the parking lot wiring the funds, while simultaneously alerting collections agencies to Lisa's lingering credit card balances and Rick's under the table gigs. Nothing devastating, but enough to trigger audits that would force accountability and keep them scrambling, a witty capstone to my cycle of reprisals, delivered with a dark humor in imagining their surprise at the sudden scrutiny, yet it rang profoundly hollow in the fluorescent-lit lot as I realized this pettiness had alienated the very people who might have rallied around me had I trusted sooner, leaving viewers to grapple with the emotional dissonance of rooting for my comeuppance in a story where my choices bred more division than the healing the win could have wrought. Elena's call came as I navigated the return drive, her voice a steady anchor amid the chaos, inquiring about Mom's status and offering practical backup without pressing for details, so I invited her to my house for the first time since the jackpot, a modest ranch that now felt like a stage set for revelations, where over chamomile tea in the kitchen she unpacked her knowledge, piecing together the lottery puzzle from patterns like my unexplained absences and the public trust filings that savvy folks could unearth, explaining that she'd extended her hand because she'd walked a similar path, widowed young and rebuilding from scratch, without fanfare, understanding how silence could isolate even as it protected. Yet her candor carried a twist in the form of a shared connection. Her late husband had consulted on lottery security for years, imparting lessons on the curses of sudden wealth that echoed Mom's vague warnings, suggesting perhaps an indirect link through professional circles that left me pondering if her kindness was purely altruistic or subtly influenced by that inherited caution, a dilemma that heightened the uncertainty as we pored over her folder of advisor recommendations, her literal hand clasping mine in reassurance amid the growing conflict of potential exposures, from Tom's resurfacing texts laced with concern and Karen's belated gift card for hard times, both rebuffed in my final acts of digital severance, blocking them to sever the opportunistic ties once and for all. In the weeks that followed, I asserted more control, paying off lingering debts quietly and forging a tentative alliance with Elena through regular coffee meetups where advice flowed bidirectionally without the taint of blood or history, yet ambiguities persisted. Like shadows at dusk was her unwavering support, truly selfless or tied to some unspoken family lore that the curse represented a deeper Jenkins entanglement waiting to surface, and as I gazed at the safe holding the ticket's remnants, questions swirled endlessly. Who else had glimpsed the truth through the cracks I'd created, and would this one extended hand endure when the full weight of revelations inevitably dropped, forcing me to confront whether in America's relentless grind trust remained a rare luxury or just another high-stakes gamble where the real fortune lay not in the millions, but in the fragile choice to reach back without reservation, leaving the ending suspended in that provocative limbo where certainty dissolved into the what-ifs that mirrored life's own unresolved chapters.